Back in 1982, Michael Jackson was at the top of his career with the release of Thriller. Magic Johnson was leading the LA Lakers to an NBA championship, and gas was just 91 cents a gallon. But Ford, over in Detroit, was about to shake up the light-duty truck market forever with the release of the first production diesel. That's right, today we're going to be talking about the Ford Powerstroke, the nightmares and the incredible motors they have created over the years, from start to finish, including those IDIs that nobody likes. Not only have the motors changed significantly since the start of the Powerstroke series, but it actually started way back in 1982 with a motor called the 6.9 IDI, produced by International. But to give you even more background, in 1978, Chevy, or Oldsmobile, would release the 5.7 diesel, which was not a great motor. But it would start the diesel race among the light-duty truck market. And Ford, not wanting to be outdone, would partner up with the International Harvester. Yes, that International Harvester. In 1977, International began development on the 6.9 IDI, hoping to, put that motor in some of their tractors, replace some of the gas options at the time, and more importantly, to our story anyway, they wanted to put a motor in the light-duty truck market. And with Ford looking around for a diesel replacement, well, it turned out to be a perfect fit because it was almost a direct fit to that 351 Windsor. And I know I said gas was just 91 cents a gallon, but there was a fuel crisis at the time. And people were looking for a more economical option. The 351 made 180 horsepower with 325 foot-pounds of torque at just 12 miles to the gallon. Meanwhile, the 6.9, while just short at 170 horsepower and 315 foot-pounds of torque, well, it got 20 miles to the gallon roughly. So, in 1982, Ford and International would partner up to put their motors in Ford truck. Now, if we're going to be honest, the 6.9 IDI was nothing like what diesels are today. It had indirect injection, it had no turbo, and it didn't make any power. But because there was no turbo and because there was no direct injection, that made the motors really cheap and easy to produce, and supposedly more reliable. 6.9 IDI was very popular, with 436,000 engines being produced in just 5 years, until the 7.3 IDI would come out in 1988. 7.3 IDI, while not only being a bigger motor, would get a few improvements along the way. This 7.3 would make 185 horsepower and 307 foot-pounds of torque now, beating out the 351 completely, showing that diesels in the light-duty truck market were here to stay. As far as improvements goes, they just made the head a little bit stronger, flowed a little better, so on and so forth. Nothing would change for about 5 years until in 1993 they finally offered a turbo option on that IDI motor. That turbo would be an internally wastegated 82 millimeter, bumping the horsepower by 5 to 190 and the torque to 338 foot-pounds. It took 11 years for International to add 15 horsepower with a turbo and 400 cc's of larger motor.
What the hell is even that?
Quick note, something kind of fun. Speaking of adding horsepower, you ever heard of Banks Power? Yes, that Banks Power. Well, one of Banks' first aftermarket turbo kits would be offered for the 6.9 IDI. Their turbo kit added 75 horsepower and supposedly cut the 0 to 60 time in half, from 50 seconds to 27 seconds while pulling 12,000 pounds. They added more power out of a smaller motor than International could do with a bigger motor and also a turbo. And when the 7.3 eventually came out, Banks would also make a kit for that, bumping the power by 80 horsepower up to 264. These kits ended up being super popular and were actually a pretty simple bolt-on. And you see these things everywhere. I went to high school with a guy that had a 7.3 IDI with a Banks kit on it. They were very common. So back to 1993, we have the 7.3 IDI making no power with a turbo on it. It's time to change some things. And that is when we would go to 1994, where we get the first Powerstroke. The 7.3 Powerstroke probably rings a bell for you non-truck guys out there, because these things are super popular. To this day, they are one of the only Powerstrokes that people buy. While sharing the same displacement, the new 7.3 was a complete redesign. That factory turbo would stay as a standard option, but they would finally switch over to an electronically controlled direct injection. And similar to the Cummins in its first turbo diesel iteration, you can check out that video, there would be different power options depending on which transmission you got. So you got 250 horsepower and 505 foot-pounds of torque with the auto option, and 275 horsepower and 525 with the manual option. Just to give you perspective, if you forgot already, the 7.3 IDI made 190 horsepower from the factory with a turbo. So yeah, things are improving a little bit. It does seem like a big jump, but to be honest, from the factory, these things were on training wheels. They had the strength and reliability to be pushed harder than those stock numbers. Kind of meaning it wasn't powerful enough to hurt itself. It's like if Eddie Hall deadlifted 100 pounds, he could do it all day, every day. One of the things that became known along with that Powerstroke name is the HPOP system, the high pressure oil pump. The reason that is so important is because that is actually what drove the injectors on this thing. Like I said before, they were electronically controlled, but that oil pressure would be used to actually push the fuel into the cylinder, requiring no injection pump. This system turned out to be really, really good because the electronic fuel injection pumps at the time were not all that great, and common rail wasn't common. So in a common rail system, the entire injection system is under pressure, and then basically what happens is the electronics just tell it to open. On this system, the oil pressure is doing all the work, pressurizing the fuel as it comes to the injector in order to make it last way longer. On top of that, mechanically, it was built to last forever. Came with forged internals stock, had 6 head bolts per cylinder, meaning these things could handle like 40 psi of boost stock. And the stock turbo in these things was fixed geometry. It didn't have anything that moved in it other than the turbine. Less moving parts means way more reliability once again. With all those combined factors, that's how the 7.3 became known for its crazy reliability. I mean, seriously, the only common issues on these things were failing weird sensors like the crank position sensor, which I had a 7.3 at one point and I replaced it in like 30 seconds. Now, as Powerstrokes kind of came out, they would get subtle changes as they went on. So, of course, the 7.3 wouldn't stay the same. And in 1999, with a body style update, they would get a few more changes on the motor. So those pre-99 7.3s had single shot injectors, which were good. They were very reliable, but they didn't burn as clean. So with the 99 change, they switched to a split shot injector, which basically all it did was give a little shot before the main shot to kind of even out the fuel ratio, which gave you a more complete burn, things burning cleaner, better for everybody. Along with the change, they did go a little bit bigger to a 140cc injector as opposed to the 120 that was in it before. The other major change they did in 1999 was the turbo system. I couldn't believe it when I was researching this video, but in 1994 they came with a non-wastegated turbo from the factory. So in 99 they switched to an internally wastegated turbo. They added an intercooler as well. From 99 to 2002 nothing changed, except for in 2002 they switched to a different connecting rod, which is a powdered metal rod. They're known for being a little less strong, but basically all they did is they'd take powdered metal and push it into a mold and then heat it up, and it was kind of like a pressed forge thing. They were experimenting, trying shit out. But they were much cheaper to produce, so I think that's why they switched over from forged. They also had a catalytic converter in 02. I don't know why diesels had cats back then. Like I said, the 7.3 Powerstroke was very popular. From 94 to 2003, they made 2 million of these motors. If you haven't figured it out, like I stated, that's because the 7.3 is, to this day, kind of known as like the mule of the diesel world. Certainly not getting anywhere in a hurry. It was not a very fast motor, but fuck, it could go forever. And thanks to being overbuilt and electronically controlled, these things can be tuned up to 400 horsepower with just a chip. I mean, there's stories of guys with 7.3 Powerstroke Econoline vans pushing 40 psi and 400 horsepower. Like, crazy shit. 2003, they would switch over to the world famous 6-blow. The 7.3 is a mule, like I said. Well, the 6.0 is like a coked up racehorse. Made to perform. Not for long, but hell, it could put on a show. The 6.0 made 325 horsepower and 570 foot-pounds of torque from the factory. This is a 75 horsepower increase from the 7.3 out of a smaller motor. These improvements would come from a slightly higher compression ratio. They doubled the valves per cylinder from 2 to 4, and they switched over to a VGT turbo, which definitely doesn't help with reliability, but it helps with the get up and go. In simple terms, a VGT turbo basically changes the size of the compression chamber to make power faster. It's really hard to explain, but that's the simple version of it. Other than those improvements, the 6.0 is kind of a cheap out compared to the 7.3. It really did have great potential. They were fast, but it just fell apart from the start line. That was due to the EGR system being introduced into the Powerstrokes for the first time. Now, the EGR system was new, and well, it wasn't just a symptom of the issues, it was the cause of all the issues of this motor. The EGR system basically reroutes exhaust gas into the intake to help burn it off again to get a cleaner exhaust output. But due to where the oil cooler and the EGR system were placed on this truck in the back of the motor, it would cause heat issues. And coolant, we think of it as being able to handle heat, but not that kind of heat. Basically, the coolant would cook and plug up, and same with the oil. It would cook and plug up because there was just so much heat that you couldn't deal with it really. And basically the only solution for your EGR issues on these trucks was just get rid of it. If you live in a state where they inspect or you have to pass emissions, you can't just do that. And it's not exactly legal. And the other major problem comes from, remember class? Do you remember what I told you to remember? The HPOP, the high pressure oil system. In the first year of the 6.0, the drive gear was known to shatter or just completely break. And other than getting shards of things in your oil, it would just cause the truck to completely shut off and you're dead on the side of the road. So we're not making a very good name for ourselves to start off with those kinds of issues, but it gets better. There's also a sensor called the injection control pressure sensor, basically making sure all the fuel pressure is just right. Well, they put it on the HPOP. And like I said before, we were getting some heat issues. These sensors weren't really built for that heat. So sensor fails with too much heat, once again, you're dead on the side of the road. In the next model year, Ford would address these issues with a stronger HPOP and relocating that ICP sensor. Well, with this new design, it doesn't get better, by the way. With this new design, the HPOP, where it would connect into the engine, the oil seals were known for failing, and high pressure oil pump causing a massive oil leak. Well, when Ford would address that with improved oil seals, technicians in Ford dealerships were having issues where when you went to pull it apart, the snap-in style connectors would fail, ruining your new O-rings, once again causing a massive oil leak. The next set of issues came from the fuel injection control module. The FICM for short was known for being very, very voltage sensitive. Basically what could happen is if your batteries start to go bad or your alternator goes out and that FICM drops below the voltage that it likes, it will just shut off. Or you go out to start your truck in the morning on a cold winter day, it might just not start. It might just crank forever. It can crank, but it just won't fire up that FICM. Low voltage to the FICM could actually ruin your injectors. And I actually went and found on forums, and people were saying at the time it cost around $2,000 to get your injectors replaced. So a bad battery could turn into a $2,000 injector job, losing your truck for potentially weeks to the Ford dealership. And finally, the issue that got that nickname of the 6 blow is the head gasket. Still don't really understand why they did this, but they went with 4 head bolts per cylinder as opposed to the 6 from the 7.3. I know it's cheaper, but they went to a better flowing head, higher compression ratio, and a more powerful turbo. Like, they were just asking for failure at that point. This would end up being a major weakness, because if you added any power at all, these head gaskets were known to just blow. And if you start having cooling issues, once again, you're asking for it. So as opposed to that 7.3, if you want to upgrade these things or add any power at all, you do have to go for head studs, which is not a hard thing to find, not cheap, but not a hard thing to find. A very common thing you'll see when shopping for a 6.0 is a bulletproofed motor. These were basically kits that kind of fixed all of these common issues, especially the EGR issues. There's no real kit that addresses the fuel injection control module thing because, I mean, that's a Ford computer system. You kind of can't reproduce that for cheap anyway. But if you do go through with all of that and fix all these issues, these trucks are badass. In my opinion, this was International's first attempt at making something that wasn't just a tractor motor. It was made for the roads. It had the power, it could still tow. It was really a great motor, except for all these faults. Yeah, the 6.0 was kind of a nightmare, but I think they're pretty cool. I want to buy one day, even with all these issues, because they're fast. And that exhaust note is just... Aside from all the pesky little issues, the 6.0 would actually be responsible for one of the biggest lawsuits in automotive history. This would eventually lead to Ford breaking ties with International, but we'll get to that later. And mostly because of all those little issues, the 6.0 would only last about 4 years, being canceled in 2007, with the release of the 6.4 liter in 2008. And if you thought Ford or International were going to learn from their mistakes, boy, are you mistaken.
Oh shit, here we go again.
To start off on a positive note, the 6.4 would come out with the first ever compound turbo system from Powerstroke and the first common rail for the Powerstroke system, probably because of all those H-pop issues they had. This would come with a new body style too. Essentially the way a common rail system works, I kind of explained it before, but there is a high pressure fuel pump that pumps it up to injector pressure, and then all the injectors do at that point is just know when to fire off of the computer. They don't have to build pressure or have an oil pump system to push down on it. They would actually switch over to have the injection system electronically controlled by the main computer, not because of FICM issues, I don't think, but more because we have a DPF system now in these stupid new diesels. But the best part of the 6.4 is the compound turbo system, like I mentioned before. And this system was actually able to make 40 psi in stock form without a tuner. The main goal of a compound turbo setup is you have that smaller one pumping into that bigger one, giving you a much smoother ride up into the boost rather than waiting all day for it to finally hit and then take off. These new improvements would yield a 25 horsepower increase up to 350 now and 525 foot-pounds of torque. And that doesn't really sound like all that much compared to what we were dealing with the 6.0. This new motor is bigger. It has a cooler turbo system. It has a better injection system. So 25 horsepower doesn't really seem like all that much. Well, that's because of the DPF system that I mentioned before. Once again, that DPF would basically be the cause of everything wrong with the 6.4. If you don't know what a DPF is, the DPF is a diesel particulate filter. I'm just so used to calling it a DPF. Basically, all that does is it's a filter in the exhaust that catches all of the unwanted soot that comes out of diesels that you've seen rolling coal, right? So it prevents that, it blocks it in the exhaust, and then the way it would clean is through a process called regeneration. This process in the Powerstrokes involved shooting fuel on the exhaust stroke, raising exhaust temps up to burn off everything left in that filter. And that regen process is where the issues came from. Essentially, what would happen is extra fuel is going in out of time, and it would make its way into the motor past the rings just because there's so much fuel going into this motor, and it would fill up your oil pan. Not to mention all that extra diesel being poured into the oil, thinning it out isn't exactly great for motors, but it also ruins your fuel mileage. The new 6.4 was getting 11 to 13 miles to the gallon, which was exactly the miles per gallon that the 351 Windsor was getting, that Ford wanted to replace with a more efficient motor, which caused the 6.9 IDI. And those high exhaust temps, well, those didn't really go without symptoms either. Basically, all of that high exhaust temp has to flow through your turbo, cooking oil seals in the process, causing oil to flow out the turbo into the DPF, plugging up the DPF more, causing it to get stuck in regen, just overheating, dumping oil, killing the motor. The excessive heat would also be known to cause piston rings to lose their spring tension. They would get so hot, causing blow-by and low compression in the back cylinders. So if you're not familiar with diesels, compression is everything. That is how these motors run. So if you're losing compression at all, that motor doesn't work anymore. Go ahead, you can leave your glow plug comment down below. It'll make me very happy for you to tell me that. Glow plugs or the spark plugs, they're not. Stop. One of my favorite things from all the DPF issues on this was Ford put out an official recall in regards to potential for flames to come from the tailpipe of the truck. And the recall was just a new tune that allegedly fixed that. And of course, we can't learn from our mistakes, so EGR cooler issues would come again with the exact same issues. Get too hot, cook the coolant, plug up, doesn't work anymore, overheats. And if you haven't figured it out, overheating on this motor is already an issue. Now, once again, just like the 6.0, the 6.4 is a great motor if you can get rid of all that shit. If you can delete the DPF, get rid of the EGR, you have a great truck. Now, all of this is illegal and won't pass inspection, but who fucking cares about that anyway, right?
I don't give a fuck, Keisha.
You get rid of all that. This thing has an overkill injection pump and compound turbos. Like, this motor was dying to make more power. There's even a claim that with a intake, an exhaust, and a plug-in tuner, you could add 300 horsepower to these things. That's a 650 horsepower diesel. And the next step in the power range of these things is if you can keep these things cool, there's people making 900 horsepower out of these 6.4s. Just like the 6.0, the 6.4 in stock form is just a nightmare. But with a relatively low entry point into performance, you can make 650 horsepower, allegedly. And you remember that lawsuit thing I was telling you about? Well, the 6.4 would mark the end of International and Ford's relations. The lawsuit kicked off in 2007 with Ford claiming that International had raised the price of the motors with no cause. And Ford also claimed International didn't pay their fair share at all of what the 6.0 issues brought on. Ford claimed there was $1 billion in repairs that International did not help repay. After years and years of litigation, they would finally pause production of motors in 2010, and that suit actually didn't even end until 2018. It went on for 11 years. And the settlement actually favored International for some reason. I couldn't really figure out too much about it, but they won out. With International not at the helm anymore, Ford had to bring it into their own house with the 6.7 Powerstroke in 2011. The 6.7 is actually still the current Powerstroke from 2010 until today. This motor has been around for 14 years, so there's been a lot of changes. So we're going to go through everything and break down all of the little changes as well as the initial release of that motor. First major thing, obviously, 6.4 to 6.7, a little bit bigger motor, and they also switched over to that CP4 Bosch injection pump that is like the gold standard of the diesel industry. They also switched back to a single turbo system, but it has a weird like double impeller on it. That turbo would actually be mounted in the valley of the motor in the middle because the heads are on backwards now, so the intake is on the outside and the exhaust is down the middle. All these changes would bump the horsepower number up to 390 now and 860 foot-pounds of torque. That is 200 foot-pounds more than the 6.4 made. To handle all this power, they actually switched over to a new metallurgy process, moving away from cast iron to a material called compacted graphite iron that is stronger and lighter, as well as the return to 6 head bolts per cylinder. The 6.7 actually featured a new dual cooling system with a cool side and a hot side, the cool side running around 140 degrees and the hot side running around 190 degrees. This was to separate your hot and cool side to run different things. And that cool side actually also fitted up with a new air-to-water intercooler. The first new thing with the 6.7 is kind of funny. It's a 10 horsepower increase with a tune from the dealership for some reason, bumping it up to 400 horsepower now. With Ford's first crack at their own in-home diesel, there was definitely a few weird little issues to start out with. First issue would come from turbo bearing failures due to a ceramic ball bearing they were using, but they fixed that after 2 years. There are some mentions of glow plugs having issues, radiators having issues, the high pressure fuel pump having some minor issues, but nothing common really. But I feel like they should be mentioned just because they're problems, right? Everything would remain essentially the same until 2015, where we got a newer body style, which is probably my favorite Super Duty body style to this date. As far as engine stuff goes, there would be 2 major changes, including one to that dual cooling system. So before, the cold side actually ran through the EGR cooler as well for some reason. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea. And they would just have that hot side handle the EGR cooler by itself. The other major change was in 2015 when they switched over from the dual compressor fucking weird turbo over to a normal 65mm turbo. So switching the EGR cooler off of the low side of the cooling system and that new turbo would bump the power up to 440 horsepower as of 2015. So nothing would really change from 2015 to 2020 other than that update to the cooling system that I already mentioned. And they would switch over to a 55mm turbo, and that would bump the horsepower to 475 horsepower now and 1,050 foot-pounds of torque, which is the current numbers as of today. Well, kind of, because just last year, for some reason, Ford decided to release a high-output version of the 6.7. So there's that normal version, which still makes the 475 horsepower, but there's also a high-output version making 500 horsepower and 1,200 foot-pounds of torque. Ford's claiming that their drivetrain can pull 40,000 pounds. Now, 40,000 pounds is crazy, but you'd have to have some crazy like F650 setup to do that. But still, I mean, 40,000 pounds is insane. This is where the current Powerstroke stands today. And, well, it's come a long way. I know I didn't mention the 3.2 or the 3.0 Powerstroke, if you guys are familiar with these motors at all. The only reason I didn't do that is because I want to make a separate video on eco-diesels and the weird issues they all had and all the different manufacturers. As far as the history of the Ford diesel goes, well, it's a long one. All the way back to that naturally aspirated 6.9 IDI making 161 horsepower to today with a 500 horsepower motor that's even smaller than that starting one, with 40 years of lawsuits and compound turbos in between. That's all I have for today. If you made it to the end of this video, let me know what you think. I really enjoyed making these longer videos. I took a long time to find time to sit down and actually record it, but I really enjoyed the writing process. So if you guys want another deep dive into the history of a series of motors, let me know in the comments below. That's it for today. So make sure to subscribe to stay up to date on anything that drives.